These are your introduction to evolution notes, so let's jump right into it. So at its absolute most basic definition, all evolution is the fact that organisms change over time, right? Individual organisms as a species evolve and change over time. Now, you might live or die, and individual organisms live and die, but as a whole, species change as geological time progresses, and some change quicker than others, some change slower than others, but all evolution is just the acknowledgement that this phenomenon occurs and has been occurring for, in this case, over 3 billion years, and will continue until this planet gets engulfed by the sun. So there are three main scientists you need to be familiar with. The first is Lamarck, and the red text here is the theory that each scientist proposed. So Lamarck proposed what he called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Darwin and Wallace proposed what you are probably a little more familiar with. It got cut off here, but this says natural selection. So these two proposals are the explanation or the mechanism for the observation that organisms change over time. Remember, evolution is at its core an observation, and the theories that explain evolution are the mechanisms proposed by Lamarck and then Darwin and Wallace. So let's take a look at Lamarck's theory of acquired characteristics. Remember, a theory is a scientific explanation that is supported by data and evidence. And basically, Lamarck thought that individuals acquired traits during their lifetime and then passed them on to their offspring. So just some context, this is early 1800s. Lamarck predated Darwin. Their lifespans did overlap slightly, I believe. But Lamarck was the first to realize that organisms actually do change over time. And this should really say species, not individual organisms, but really it's the species that are changing over time. But individual organisms seem to be adapted to their environment. We really kind of started to realize that Earth is not static. It wasn't like things always existed in a certain state and they've just been like that forever. We were starting to understand that change is the norm, change is the default, and we were looking for explanations for that change. And this was Lamarck's first crack at it, if you will. He said that organisms acquire or lose traits during their lifetimes, and this is the key thing here. His quintessential example is giraffe necks. So the idea was that if a giraffe stretches its neck during its lifetime because it's, for instance, reaching leaves high up in the trees, that increase in neck length would then be passed on to offspring. And knowing what we know now about genetics, we know that this type of change would have to occur in the DNA of a gamete in an egg cell or a sperm cell. But this is over 100 years before we found DNA. Lamarck had no idea what DNA was, so in hindsight, this kind of seems ridiculous. And as it should, this explanation was very quickly discredited. It was discredited early on in the lifespan of this theory because the data did not support it. And I'm going to draw a graph up here in the top. Remember that as you go through time, so time is on our x-axis, and the confidence of our explanation is over here on the y-axis. I'll just abbreviate that confidence. Early on in a theory's life, so with few time, I'll say time/data, we are unsure. We're not really too confident in our explanation, so we're very low on the y-axis. But as we progress with time, as we collect more data, as we move to the right in this graph, our confidence kind of approaches what we would consider to be a fact, right? The fact that the Earth revolves around the sun, for instance, is technically covered by heliocentric theory. But, we accept it as a fact, right? Germ theory is a fact. Cell theory, the fact that living things are made of cells, right? This particular theory, acquired characteristics, died very early on. It kind of died down in this region here because the data did not support it, and it never made it to the later stages of data accumulation and widespread acceptance. But you do need to nonetheless be familiar with it because it does provide some historical context and our attempts to initially explain the facts and the observation that life evolves. Now comes Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin, early 1800s. This is young Darwin. I believe he was like 23 years old when he took this trip around the world on the HMS Beagle. You don't have to remember this stuff. I mean, it's nice to say, oh yeah, the Beagle, I recognize that as Darwin's ship, but I'm not going to ask you questions like that. That's a little bit too straightforward. This is just some basic background. The point is that Darwin was the first scientist who really collected solid data that laid out the foundations for what we understand as natural selection, right? And again, he started in the British Isles, but his most famous data collection points among his entire trip was the Galapagos off the west coast of Ecuador in South America, right? And basically the Galapagos is a chain of volcanic islands, very similar to Hawaii. But Darwin noticed that each of these islands, despite being close to each other in geography, had very different climates. Therefore, they had different types of vegetation and different sources of food. And the wildlife on those islands behaved accordingly. And the idea that he developed in part was that, well, maybe life from South America made its way out into these islands so that species closest to the mainland, on these islands closest to the mainland, were most similar to the species on the South American continent, whereas the islands further west were less similar to those on the main continent. And this is actually a hypothesis that has been supported for over 150 years that we'll talk about in this unit. And it's completely accounted for by Darwin's mechanism of natural selection. And this brings us to our current theory of evolution, the theory of natural selection. Right? Again, good reminder, a well-supported, testable explanation of something that occurs in the world. The key thing is that we can test it. And this particular explanation that we're testing is trying to explain how life has changed and how it's diversified. So of all the evidence Darwin collected at the time, some of his largest pieces of evidence were fossils, both literally but also in terms of the significance of the fossils. It shows ancient life forms and what those structures look like, and we'll talk about how fossils form in class and in a different video. But these are eventually stone. It's not actual remnants of the organism at this point, and we'll talk about how that works. But basically, some fossils stop. You're looking through usually sedimentary rock, and some end. And he asked, why have some species disappeared? How are fossils related to living species? How are extant or currently living species similar to or different than the ones kind of embalmed, if you will, as fossils, right? He also noticed that different structures and organisms matched their environments, right? And the different habitats that he saw had predictably different organisms. And one example that he relied heavily on that you're probably familiar with are Darwin's finches, right? He looked particularly at beak size, and what he noticed is that in islands with low rainfall, you had larger seeds on average that necessitated larger beaks on birds. And that's exactly what he saw. The ones with more rainfall typically had more berries, more insects, and the beaks on the birds he saw usually had longer or narrower beaks. And we have conducted subsequent follow-up studies that basically confirm this. And we've actually tracked beak shape over time, and individual populations of birds over a couple decades. Peter and Rosemary Grant did this in the late 1980s and 90s, have since confirmed that individual populations or species, beaks actually do change, and they can change relatively quickly over a matter of decades. So these are adaptations, right? Features, in this case, structural features that allow animals to be better adapted or matched to their environment. And in this case, the selection pressure is what kind of food is present. That's going to inform the types of beaks that you see. If you have a narrow beak shape on an island that has hard to crack seeds, you're not going to eat because your beak doesn't adequately break those shells and you're going to starve. So the genes for building your narrowed beak will not continue in that environment. And that's really the core of natural selection. Some other adaptations he saw, Darwin was also famous for his studies on tortoises. Very similar thing here with the shape of the shell matched the type of vegetation that the tortoise ate. So either ground feeder, in the left example, bushes necessitate being able to raise your neck a little higher up. So the shell was selected to be a little bit more recessed or receding back behind the base of the neck. All right, Darwin didn't come up with this idea in a vacuum, though. He actually took inspiration from some geologists, and you do need to know these people. Hutton and Lyell were geologists who were formally introducing the idea that Earth is actually very, very old. And as a species, individual humans live what? Currently, 85, 79, 80 years is the average, depending on where you are in the world. It's very, very hard for our brains to get an appreciation for large units. And the age of the Earth is no exception here. But certain features on our planet and forces that we see, volcanic eruptions and the layering down of sedimentary rock, and the deep time you're actually looking at when you look down through the Earth's crust, it is inescapable that our planet is billions of years old. And we have since done studies, and there's actually a good Cosmos episode on this that details actually how we calculated the age of the Earth to be about 4.5 billion years old. But that gives us plenty of time for evolution to occur. It actually had to be plenty of time because evolution at its core is a fundamentally slow process with some exceptions. But these features provided some clues that, hey, maybe Earth isn't just a couple thousand years old. Maybe we need to entertain the idea it's significantly older. And that's, at this point in time, what we were figuring out. Another scientist that influenced Darwin is Thomas Malthus. He was an economist who studied human population growth. And this idea kind of revealed the reality that individual species, or individuals of any species, really produce way too many organisms. It doesn't take someone who is very astute to the world around them to realize that there's a lot of what seems to be stupid, needless, unnecessary suffering. Why is there so much unnecessary death and starvation, etc.? And Malthus proposed this idea that individuals produce too much. And actually, evolutionarily, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense because the more kids you have, the more likely your genes are going to make it to the next generation. But a side effect of that is that a lot of those kids die. And this is true for many, many species. Some species are worse than others, right? Humans might produce or have produced, between 5 and 10 kids per individual. Probably before the 1800s, maybe even through the 1800s. But you have some insect species that produce, hundreds or thousands of baby insects, and the vast majority, 90% plus of those individuals will die, right? So overpopulation demands death. But this is actually critical because it provides the diversity for natural selection to act upon. It invariably means that some individuals will be better suited to their environment than others simply because there is so many. So, culminating all of this, Darwin came away from this trip basically with a very rudimentary version of natural selection, which we'll talk about this unit, but didn't publish them at the time because Victorian England historically was very, very conservative. The conventional wisdom was that Earth was created, it was only a couple thousand years old, and life and processes on the planet were immutable or static. And really this idea went against all of it. And eventually when the idea was proposed, the King of England actually commented, he's like, where is room for God in this? Because God is, it's the elephant in the room at this point. And the response was, well, it's a natural process. There isn't really a role for that because it's natural selection, right? Which I think goes to show that Darwin's concerns were actually quite warranted. But Darwin ends up getting a letter from a guy named Alfred Wallace, who was conducting very similar experiments in Malaysia on the other side of the globe, which was essentially the same thing. Wallace had the exact same idea. He didn't call it natural selection, but it was, for all intents and purposes, natural selection. And this kind of prompted Darwin to hurry up and publish The Origin of Species in the mid-1800s. Right, and that kind of sums up the basic history of natural selection and gives us kind of an overview for some of the scientists. So here's just a quick thing on Alfred Wallace. Again, same ideas as Darwin. What we would call now is survival of the fittest, or I'll actually talk about this too. Survival of the good enough is probably a better term. We'll discuss that more later. But again, so Wallace didn't have as much evidence, he hadn't published, but he did prompt Darwin to publish, and that's actually probably why you're more familiar with Darwin than Wallace, but you do need to know both. So, as we move forward through this unit, there are a couple of key features you are going to have to keep in mind for Darwin's mechanism for evolution, i.e. the actual theory here, natural selection. Life is a struggle for existence, and this picture is in the way, but basically overproduction of offspring means that competition for resources and subsequent suffering are inevitable. That is the biological explanation for why there is suffering in this world. And it invariably leads to what we now call survival of the fittest, or what we're going to call survival of the good enough. And this is going to cause individuals to be adapted or matched to their environment. Individuals that are less matched on average will have less reproductive success, and the genes for their poorly adaptive traits will not make it as frequently into the future via little babies. So that's an overview. We'll discuss more together. I hope this helps, and I will see you then.